News of the times, the doctors, the brothers, and the first great failure of forensic science. Paris, 1823. Before the Victorian era produced its famous poisoners and courtroom chemists, there was another case, earlier, quieter, and far more unsettling. A case that revealed for the first time that science could fail, not because it was misapplied or misunderstood, but because in 1823 the science itself was simply not equal to the task. Across the Channel in Paris, two wealthy brothers died within months of one another. Their doctor, young, capable, and quietly burdened by responsibility, stood at the centre of both deaths. The symptoms suggested poisoning, the circumstances deepened suspicion, and the behaviour surrounding the events demanded explanation. And yet, when the chemists examined the organs, they found nothing. For Britain, already uneasy about the growing availability of household poisons, this case raised a disturbing question. If a poison left no trace, how was justice to be done? Today, we return to the story that forced courts and scientists alike to confront that uncertainty. A story predating Palmer, predating Pritchard, predating the great Victorian toxicologists, yet shaping all of them in ways rarely acknowledged. This is the case of Dr Edmé Castaing, the two Ballet brothers, and the first major failure of forensic science. And in further particulars, we leave France and England altogether for a brief turn to the American West via the pages of an East Kent newspaper. A Pullman carriage, a polite inquiry, and a horse thief whose reputation seems to have travelled rather more widely than he ever did. Settle in for a tale from the early 1820s, a period of scientific ambition, domestic fear, and the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the evidence most needed is the evidence that will not appear. Forensic toxicology in late Georgian times. In 1823, the discipline now recognized as forensic toxicology was still in its earliest stages. England possessed no reliable laboratory methods for detecting poison within the human body. The landmark tests so familiar to Victorian investigations, Marsh's arsenic test of 1836, Reinsch's test of 1841, and later refinements, had not yet been conceived. In their absence, coroners and medical practitioners were obliged to rely on observation rather than objective science. A suspected poisoning was assessed through the smell of the stomach contents, the colour and texture of any vomit, and the broad character of the symptoms, and the attending physician's own judgment. The arsenic problem. This scientific inadequacy became all the more pressing because arsenic had embedded itself throughout everyday life. The English press had begun warning of an alarming increase in sudden deaths, many of which were suspected to involve arsenic but could not be proven as such. Consequently, without a technical means of detection, poisoning cases devolved into contests of medical opinion. Suspicion was easily raised, but certainty remained elusive. By the early 1820s, accidental and deliberate arsenic poisonings had become sufficiently common for the British public to speak of an arsenic panic. Why the Castaing case mattered in Britain. When news reached Britain that Two brothers, both wealthy and previously in the care of their doctor, had died under suspicious circumstances, and that no trace of poison whatever had been found. The case attracted considerable professional interest. British coroners, medical journals, and early toxicologists followed the proceedings closely. The matter demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, that an educated poisoner might act with near impunity. If a poison could be administered that left no detectable residue, the science of the day was powerless to expose it. For British authorities, the case served as an early warning that forensic toxicology required urgent development. The need would not be met until 1836, when James Marsh introduced the first reliable test for arsenic, a response in part to the rising unease created by cases such as this. Until then, one question lingered. If poison leaves no trace, how can the law ever hope to prove a murder? Morphine, the new killer. Poisoning in the early 19th century was almost synonymous with arsenic. It was the substance most readily available, the least detectable, and the most feared. For this reason, the suspected use of morphine in the Castaing affair appeared highly unusual. Morphine, or morphia as it was then called, was a relatively recent medical discovery. It was obtained only through trained physicians and held in small quantities by chemists, chiefly for experimental or specialist treatment. Its cost alone placed it far beyond the reach of ordinary poisoners. More significantly, the symptoms of morphia poisoning could be mistaken with ease for natural illness, drowsiness, confusion, weakness, respiratory collapse, and, in severe cases, convulsions. Most troubling of all, no test existed anywhere in Europe capable of detecting morphine after death. Its organic nature placed it beyond the reach of contemporary chemical analysis. Thus, in an age already struggling to identify traditional poisons, morphine introduced a new complexity, a modern scientific toxin that could kill without leaving any demonstrable trace. New doctors in early Victorian times. The professional circumstances of a newly qualified doctor in 1823 were difficult. Physicians were required to establish their own practices at their own expense. Rooms had to be rented, surgeries furnished, and instruments purchased before any income could be earned. Patients were not guaranteed. Reputation was built slowly, often over years, and competition with established doctors, apothecaries, midwives, and traditional healers was considerable. Many young practitioners lived on modest means throughout the early years of their careers, relying on family assistance or credit to remain afloat. A medical title carried social respectability, but it did not confer immediate financial security. For a young doctor already burdened by debt or domestic responsibilities, the pressures could be acute. For this case, we draw principally upon Henry Brodribb's Irving's A Book of Remarkable Criminals, which offer one of the earliest detailed reconstructions of the affair. Dr Edmé Castaing, born in 1796, was the youngest son of a respectable provincial official. By all accounts, intelligent, industrious, and ambitious. His early academic career had been exemplary. At the College of Angers, he carried off several prizes, and at the Paris School of Medicine, he worked steadily within the modest allowance granted by his father. Nothing in those early years suggested the making of a criminal. It was during this period, however, that he formed what Irving described as a passionate attachment to a woman markedly older than himself, a widow, the mother of 3 children and living on diminished means. The sincerity of Castang's devotion was not doubted by contemporaries. Irving makes a rare authorial assertion here. Of the genuine depth and sincerity of this passion there can be no doubt. There is no evidence that this woman was ever mistreated, endangered, or poisoned by him. Indeed, even at his trial, when every aspect of his life was laid bare, she was not presented as a victim, nor even summoned as a witness, despite the prosecution's willingness to use the private lives of the accused to their advantage. What emerges instead is a picture of an earnest, besotted young man who took on far more than he could afford. By 1821 he and the widow had 2 children, and she, accustomed to a certain standard, expected to be supported in a fashion that Castaing, still only a newly qualified doctor, was quite unable to provide. Work was irregular, earnings were small. It was noted that he struggled even to balance his professional obligations within the demands of a difficult domestic life. Financial troubles soon pressed in from all sides. In 1818 he had unwisely guaranteed a friend's debt of 600 francs, which fell due 2 years later. Payment proved impossible. His mother exhausted every avenue to procure leniency from the creditor. His father refused assistance altogether. Thus, by the age of 26, Castaing was burdened with a dependent mistress and her 3 children, 2 further children of his own, professional uncertainty, and debts that had become unmanageable. He was not yet a villain, but already a man cornered by circumstance, entirely responsible for far too many lives, and wholly without the income to support them. It was a dangerous position for a young doctor trained in psychology, familiar with the actions of powerful drugs, and increasingly desperate for a solution. And it was at precisely this moment that 2 wealthy brothers, Hippolyte and Auguste Ballet, entered his life, setting in motion the chains of events that would lead to one of the century's most unsettling failures in forensic toxicology. The Ballet brothers. Among the acquaintances of Dr Castaing formed during his years in Paris were 2 young men of roughly his own age, Auguste and Hippolyte Ballet, the sons of a prosperous family and recently come into independent means. The acquaintance appears to have been of several years' standing, although not equal in warmth. According to Irving, it was Hippolyte, the younger brother, who developed the strongest attachment to Castaing. Frail in health, studious, and gentle in manner, Hippolyte found particular comfort in the company of a friend who also possessed medical knowledge, especially as his consumptive condition worsened. By 1822, he was spending periods at a well-known spa town on medical advice, and Castaing was frequently at his side. With Auguste, the relationship was one of a different nature. His childhood had been marked by maternal neglect, so severe that he had been sent out to be boarded at the age of 5, while his siblings remained at home. The experience produced an adult character, energetic, extravagant, and unstable. Yet despite these contrasts, one son cherished and the other rejected, the brothers had grown closer after the death of their parents, each inheriting a substantial fortune of approximately 260,000 francs, value approximately 1.25 million in 2026 for each brother. Castang's relations with Auguste were grounded less in sentiment than in shared confidences, and later in the delicate secrecy surrounding Hippolyte's intentions regarding his will. It was Hippolyte who generally considered Castaing his fast friend, relying on his medical attention and enjoying his company. Auguste's association with Castaing seems to have come chiefly through his brother and through later financial dealings. The contrast between the brothers was striking. Hippolyte, refined, intelligent, affectionate, and increasingly unwell, a young man whose declining health made him particularly dependent on those around him. Auguste, impulsive, indulgent, and financially reckless, yet capable of strong attachments and deeply sensitive to perceived loyalty or betrayal. Between the three men, a small Parisian circle was formed, a doctor struggling with debt, and two wealthy brothers whose personalities could not have been more different. That their fortunes would soon intertwine with fatal consequences was not yet apparent, but already a pattern was visible. Hippolyte trusted Castaing implicitly. Auguste trusted him selectively, and as later events would show, unwisely. The decline of Hippolyte Ballet. As Hippolyte's health deteriorated in the latter part of 1822, Castaing's presence in his life became increasingly constant. Trial notes suggest that Hippolyte regarded him not merely as a physician, but as his fast friend, trusting him more completely than any other person in his circle. The young man's constitution had been weakened for some time, and periods at the local spa town were prescribed in the hope that rest and mineral waters might arrest the decline, although all this, Castaing was a regular attendant. In the autumn of 1822, however, Hippolyte was seized by an abrupt and violent illness. The symptoms, vomiting, abdominal distress, fever and swelling, were sufficiently serious that his sister attempted to enter the sick room to see him. She was refused admission by Castaing, who insisted that the sight of family would disturb the patient. According to Irving, even when she presented herself in the disguise of a servant, permission was again denied. The exclusivity of Castaing's attendance attracted comments later, but at the time his explanation was accepted. Consumptive patients were often thought easily agitated. Physicians frequently restricted visitors during such crises. Despite all measures taken, Hippolyte's condition worsened rapidly. After only a few days of acute illness, he died. His death certificate listed pleurisy exacerbated by his tubercular weakness. No suspicion was formally raised. The post-mortem, in which Castaing himself assisted, recorded nothing inconsistent with a natural decline. It was only later, after subsequent events, that this period would be re-examined with unease. The post-mortem examination, in which Castaing himself took part, recorded pleurisy, surveying upon an already weakened tubercular constitution. Nothing further was remarked. No suspicion of poison was expressed, and no irregularity was noted on the medical certificate. To all appearances, Hippolyte Ballet had died from the natural progress of his disease. There had long been uneasiness with the Balet family concerning Hippolyte's intentions regarding his will. Family members noted that during his illness the young man had on several occasions discussed leaving a substantial portion of his property to charitable purposes or to individuals outside the immediate family. These conversations, although informal, had deeply troubled Auguste, who feared that his brother might be persuaded or might already have decided to alter his testament to his disadvantage. When news of Hippolyte's death reached him, Auguste was therefore seized by the belief that a will potentially unfavourable to himself had been executed, and that its suppression might yet be possible if decisive steps were taken at once. Events on the very day of his death suggested that matters were not as settled as they appeared. Auguste Balet, the surviving brother, was observed making urgent efforts to raise the considerable sum of 100,000 francs, and to do so without delay. The purpose, as later revealed, related to the suppression of a will. Auguste had been led to believe that a document existed which would disinherit him, and that the payment was required to secure its destruction. The individual said to have been entrusted with this task later stated that no such payment was ever received, nor was he involved in any such transaction. The entire sum, a fortune in itself, had disappeared. In the weeks that followed, attention was drawn to the fact that Dr Castaing, who had previously struggled to meet even modest obligations, was now in a position to make substantial financial outlays, including an investment several thousand francs at this time, prompting comment from those acquainted with his circumstances. The coincidences were regarded with interest in France, and the case was also reported in the British press, which tended to follow foreign legal proceedings of unusual character. Questions were raised, cautiously at first, concerning the disappearance of so large a sum, the existence of any disputed will, and the sudden improvement in the young doctor's financial situation. Although no formal accusation was made at this early stage, the matter began to attract wider notice as details emerged. But the matter did not rest with the death of Hippolyte Ballet. Though his passing had caused private distress within the family, it had raised no formal suspicion. The medical certificate had been accepted without challenge, and life in Paris appeared to resume its ordinary course. It was the death of Auguste Balet, occurring scarcely 8 months later and under marked different circumstances, that brought the entire sequence of events into public view. Auguste, unlike his brother, had been in vigorous health, of active habits, and described by acquaintances as being in excellent spirits when he set out with Dr Castaing on a brief excursion to St. Cloud. His sudden collapse during this journey, followed by a rapid and unexplained decline, attracted immediate comment. When the post-mortem in this second case likewise failed to disclose any trace of poison, despite symptoms which many regarded as highly suggestive, the affair assumed a very different complexion. Two brothers, both associated closely with the same medical attendant, had died within a short period. In each instance, the chemical examination proved inconclusive. The coincidence was noted with increasing unease, and the limits of contemporary toxicology were brought sharply into focus. It was this second death, so different in character from the first, that transformed a private bereavement into a matter of legal and scientific significance. A holiday for two, and one returns. In the last days of May 1823, Auguste Balet and Dr Castaing left Paris for a short excursion to St. Cloud, a popular destination for brief retreats from the city. Auguste, by all contemporary reports, was in excellent health and high spirits when the two set out. Nothing in his appearance suggested the approach of any serious illness. Upon their arrival at the inn, warmed wine was brought to the table by a servant. Both men appeared to partake of it. Auguste at once remarked that the wine had an unpleasant taste, and the servant made a similar observation. Shortly afterwards, Castaing went upstairs, explaining that he had been summoned to attend a chambermaid who was said to be unwell. The maid later denied having sent for him. During the night, Auguste was seized with a sudden and violent illness, marked by vomiting, extreme physical distress, and periods of collapse. By dawn, his condition had worsened alarmingly. At this critical moment, and before any local medical assistance had been secured, Castaing left the hotel at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning and made his way on foot to Paris, a distance of nearly 10 miles. On reaching the city, he visited a chemist and purchased 12 grains of tartar emetic and 36 grains of acetate of morphia. These quantities, recorded in the chemist's book, later became central to the inquiry. When questioned, Castaing stated that he had obtained the substance in order to destroy a number of cats and dogs, which he claimed had disturbed the guests at the St. Cloud Inn. The entire staff subsequently testified that no such nuisance had occurred during the night in question. Meanwhile, Auguste's condition continued to decline. Attempts at treatment proved ineffective, and despite further medical attendance later in the day, he died within 48 hours of leaving Paris. Auguste's condition continued to deteriorate as the day progressed. In the view of the severity of the symptoms, a local practitioner, Dr Pigache, was summoned to the inn. Upon his arrival, he requested to examine the matter that had been vomited by the patient, but was informed by Castaing that it had already been thrown away and was therefore unavailable for inspection. This refusal later attracted considerable comment, as such material was of clear diagnostic value. Despite the measures attempted, the illness advanced rapidly. By late evening, Auguste was suffering intermittent convulsions and increasingly exhaustion. Through the night, his strength failed steadily, and on the following morning he died, less than 48 hours after setting out from Paris in apparently good health. In the hours following Auguste's death, on the 1st of June 1823, Castaing's behaviour became markedly strained. That afternoon he left the Hotel de la Tête Noire for several hours. During that time, a young, fair-haired man arrived at the Paris residence of Malasses, the notary's clerk, whom Castaing routinely used as an intermediary. He delivered a letter. The letter, now preserved in the historical record, read, "My dear friend Balet has just died, but do nothing before tomorrow, Monday. I will see you and tell you yes or no whether it is time to act. I expect that his brother-in-law, Monsieur Matignon, will call and see you. I have said that I did not know what dispositions Ballet may have made, but before his death he told me to give you 2 keys which I am going to deliver to you myself tomorrow. Say nothing till I have seen you, but whatever you do, don't say you are a relative of mine." This was not the first communication about keys. Earlier, on the previous afternoon, while Auguste was still alive, Castaing had sent a message to Jean Auguste's servant ordering him to take the 2 keys of his master's desk to his cousin Malasses. Jean, distracting the doctor, and knowing that Auguste had made a will in Castaing's favour, refused to comply. Instead, he travelled in person to St. Cloud and handed the keys directly to Castaing in front of witnesses. The keys were unmistakably a point of extraordinary anxiety for the doctor, and the letter to Manasseh shows an unmistakable preoccupation with the desk, the will, and controlling the narrative that would follow Auguste's death. Later that same evening, when Castaing finally returned to the hotel, the family had already arrived. Matignon, Lebret, and friends, and suspicion was immediate. When asked whether Auguste had left a will, Castaing said no. The following day, confronted with the fact that others knew one existed, he reversed himself and admitted that the will had been deposited with Manasseh. The post-mortem examination of Auguste Balet was conducted with considerable care, the viscera being subjected to the standard chemical analysis available in 1823, yet, despite the severity and character of the symptoms, no traces of poison were detected. The result astonished many, including those who had observed the rapid onset and violent progression of the illness. It was this finding, or rather the absence of any finding, that marked the beginning of what has since been regarded as the first significant crisis in modern forensic toxicology. Two deaths, closely linked in circumstance, had now produced the same perplexing outcome. Symptoms suggestive of poisoning, but chemistry silent. The implications extended beyond France. British medical journals and legal commentators, already engaged in debate over the reliability of chemical evidence, took close note of the proceedings. If trained French analysts using the most advanced methods of the day were unable to identify any toxic substance where suspicion was strong, the question naturally arose as to how securely British murder trials could rest upon similar examinations. The case did not assert the failure of science, but it demonstrated the limits of chemistry as then practiced, limits which could not be ignored by those whose work depended upon the certainty of detection. The trial that shook forensic science. With the death of Auguste Balet and the declaration of the chemist that no trace of poison could be identified, Dr Edmé Castaing appeared to have believed, or at least briefly, that the developed science of toxicology had placed him beyond reach. In a period when chemical proof was increasingly regarded as the principal safeguard against error, the absence of any demonstrable toxic substance seemed to many observers almost insurmountable. The difficulty was immediately recognised in Britain. Newspapers and medical journals attentive to foreign cases that raised legal or scientific questions noted the unsettling implication. If poisoning could be strongly suspected yet entirely undetectable by the recognised methods of analysis, what reliance could be placed on forensic chemistry in English courts? The early decades of the 19th century had been significant advances in identifying arsenic, antimony, and other mineral poisons, and a growing confidence that science would prove decisive evidence where eyewitness testimony might falter. But these advances were still limited. Reliable tests for arsenic, including the Marsh apparatus, lay more than a decade into the future. Thus, the Castaing case appeared at an awkward moment, when toxicology was expected to offer certainty, yet lacked the means to do so. To chemists, magistrates, and coroners on both sides of the Channel, it presented a disquieting example of the limits of contemporary analysis. It was into this atmosphere of scientific uncertainty and, in some cases, of professional embarrassment that the trial of Dr Edmé Castaing opened before the Paris Assize Court in November 1823. The proceedings lasted 8 days and would become one of the most closely examined criminal trials of the age, not for the violence of the events, but for what they revealed about the fragility of forensic proof. The trial. The trial of Dr. Edmé Castaing lasted 8 days, and from its opening moments it possessed the unmistakable character of public theatre. The accused entered the courtroom with a demeanour that impressed many observers, calm, composed, almost clerical in bearing. Several witnesses described him as gentle in his manner, his eyes lowered, his voice subdued, as though he were attending a solemn rite, rather than standing charged with 2 murders, the destruction of a testamentary document, and the misappropriation of a considerable sum. If his quiet exterior suggested resignation, the act of accusation presented by the Crown offered a striking contrast. It was a substantial document, elaborate, forcefully written, and, as even contemporary commentators admitted, inclined to lead the jury towards a particular view of the case. Its argument proceeded in a clear sequence: that Hippolyte Ballet had been poisoned for financial gain, that a will favourable to Castaing had then been suppressed, and that Auguste Ballet, aware of these matters, had subsequently met the same fate. Yet upon the central scientific point the prosecution faced a difficulty. The chemical examinations conducted in both deaths had revealed no trace of poison, no morphia, no antimony, nothing upon which the law might rest a definitive assertion of a toxic agent. The prosecutors therefore advanced a position that attracted considerable attention, particularly in Britain, where debates over forensic reliability were already active. Chemical proof, the French prosecution team argued, was not indispensable. It was sufficient that the circumstances taken together should produce conviction. In other words, the absence of toxicological evidence did not preclude a finding of guilt if the surrounding facts were judged persuasive. This approach marked a significant moment in legal history. In the vacuum created by the limitations of contemporary science, circumstantial evidence, long viewed with caution, was invited to assume a primary role. For many medical and legal professionals, the implications of this shift were profound, suggesting both the promise and the peril of a system in which science might fail, but judgment must still be rendered. The failure of forensics. The foremost toxicologists in France were summoned to give evidence, among them Mathieu Joseph Bonaventure Ophelia, already recognized as one of the leading authorities in the emerging field of forensic chemistry. His Traité de poisons, published in 1814, was later expanded and became a standard reference across Europe, including Britain, where it was widely studied by medical students and coroners. Ophelia's presence therefore lent considerable scientific weight to the proceedings. His testimony was measured. The court asked whether the symptoms exhibited by Auguste Ballet, the violent gastrointestinal distress, the prostration, the convulsions, could be consistent with the action of a vegetable poison, such as morphia. Ophelia replied that they could. Could such symptoms, on the other hand, arise from a sudden natural illness unrelated to poison? He acknowledged that this too was possible. Had chemical analysis revealed the presence of any toxic substance in the organs examined? No. Ophelia stated none had been detected. Thus, the position of the scientific experts was clear. The clinical signs were such as might accompany poisoning, but the chemistry, the only means by which such a conclusion could be formally established, had yielded nothing. 2 interpretations remained open, and the science of the day could not distinguish between them. The ambiguity left by the medical testimony was a kind that would recur in later British trials. In the case of William Palmer of Rudgley in 1856, for example, it was again observed that chemical analysis, although greatly advanced, could not always furnish the degree of certainty demanded by public expectation. British toxicologists writing in subsequent years frequently referred back to the Castaing affair as one of the earliest demonstrations that the absence of detected poison could not in itself resolve the question of whether poisoning had occurred. For the jury in Paris, the effect was a disquieting one. If the science could not offer a decisive verdict, upon what were they to rely? The prosecution's response was unambiguous. The conduct of the accused, they argued, could be taken to supply what chemistry could not. Where the analytical methods of the day failed to speak, the pattern of behaviour before, during and after both deaths ought to be considered. The pattern the jury could not ignore. Piece by piece, the prosecution assembled an argument whose strength lay not in any single fact, but in the accumulation of circumstance. The case as presented proceeded in a deliberate sequence. They began with the death of Hippolyte Ballet, occurring while he was under Castaing's exclusive care, and following this with the observation that within days the doctor was able to command large sums of money for which no satisfactory explanation had been offered. Attention was then directed to the will executed by Auguste, in which Castaing was named sole legatee, and to the events immediately surrounding the second death. The court heard of the journey to St. Cloud, the early morning purchase of acetate of morphia and tartar emetic, the absence of the vomited matter when Dr. Pigache requested to examine it, the locked chamber, and the refusal of access to family members. The symptoms described by witnesses were, the prosecution argued, entirely consistent with the action of a vegetable poison, and they emphasized that the deaths of two brothers, both associated closely with the same attendant, required careful examination. Thus, although toxicological analysis yielded no demonstrable poison, the jury were asked to consider whether the combined effect of these circumstances produced conviction. The question put to them, one that would influence later judicial phrasing in Britain, was whether they possessed an inward certainty of the accused's guilt. The moment was a tense one. In the silence that followed, the mass of circumstantial detail presented over 8 days drew itself together into a single, insistent conclusion. The verdict. On the 22nd of November 1823, after 8 days of proceedings, the jury returned its verdict. Dr. Edmé Castaing was found guilty of the murder of Auguste Ballet, but not guilty of the murder of Hippolyte, and guilty of having suppressed a will. The decision reflected the structure of the prosecution's case. In the instance of Hippolyte, the evidence had been judged insufficient, but in the second death, and in the events that followed it, the jury discerned a pattern of conduct they believed conclusive, notwithstanding the absence of chemical proof. Thus the matter stood. One man dead in circumstances long regarded as natural, a second dead under circumstances that invited inquiry, a large fortune redirected, and the life of the accused placed in the hands of the state. Castaing received the verdict with marked composure. He asked only that provision be made for his children. He offered no confession and maintained without deviation that he had done nothing to merit the charges brought against him. Whether this persistence arose from innocence, from calculation, or from a belief that denial conferred a final dignity cannot now be determined. But whatever its motive, it could not alter the sentence. The execution, and a final first. At dawn on the 4th of December 1823, Dr Edmé Castaing was brought from the consigliere to the scaffold erected at the Place de Grève. Witnesses remarked upon his composure. He appeared pale, self-possessed, and, as several papers observed, unexpectedly youthful for so grave an end. When the executioner completed his final adjustments to the guillotine, Castaing lifted his eyes and uttered only two words, "Mon Dieu." The blade descended. In the aftermath, the case assumed a significance extended beyond the individual tragedy. Castaing's conviction for the murder of Auguste Balet had rested upon circumstantial evidence alone. No poison had been identified. No chemical test of the period had revealed anything upon which the law might rely. His execution therefore became one of the earliest and most widely discussed examples in modern Europe of a poisoning case in which the scientific proof was entirely negative. British commentators followed the matter closely. The trial was reported in the London press, and the absence of toxicological confirmation prompted considerable debate. Could a capital conviction properly stand where chemistry, the discipline increasingly regarded as the guarantor of certainty, had disclosed nothing? Should forensic analysis be treated as authoritative or merely as one element among others? And what conclusion was to be drawn when science offered no conclusion at all? These questions resonated with particular force in Britain, where concerns about arsenic and other poisons were already rising, and where the forensic techniques later associated with the Victorian period had not yet been developed. To many observers, the Castaing affair served as a cautionary reminder that in an age before reliable detection methods, science might fail to provide the clarity expected of it, leaving courts to navigate the uncertainties of circumstantial proof. The stories that returned to haunt him. Among the more unusual elements recorded during the proceedings was Dr Castaing's evident fondness for recounting stories, narratives offered to acquaintances, patients and friends while he awaited trial, and which would later assume a troubling significance. Two separate women testified that on different occasions Castaing had related to them a detailed account concerning a dying young man, a watchful or interfering relative, and a will altered or manipulated in such a way that an inheritance passed unexpectedly into the hands of a benevolent physician. The particulars varied from telling to telling, but the general outline remained consistent. In another instance, a story was told in which a consumptive patient had nearly been deprived of his rightful intentions through the misconduct of others, only for the attending doctor to intervene, expose the deception, and be rewarded with a substantial legacy. Again, the details differed, the structure did not. What made these narratives remarkable and deeply disquieting to the court was their unmistakable resemblance to the circumstances later alleged in the deaths of Hippolyte and Auguste Balet. The witness accounts made it appear that episodes bearing a strong similarity to the cases at trial had been described by the accused before he could have anticipated that such matters would be scrutinized in evidence. When confronted with these testimonies, Castaing replied only that he could not recollect the conversations in question. The jury, however, had no difficulty recalling them. The case of Dr Edmé Castaing occupies a curious place in the history of forensic science. It marked neither the first poisoning nor the last, but it did expose with unusual clarity the limits of early 19th century chemistry. Two deaths, linked by circumstance and suspicion, produced no chemical evidence upon which the law could securely rely. Yet a conviction was reached, and the execution proceeded, leaving physicians, jurists, and chemists to reckon with the uneasy space between scientific certainty and judicial necessity. In Britain, where anxieties about arsenic and other household poisons were already beginning to surface, the Castaing affair read as a sober reminder that the authority of science was still in formation. Detection methods would improve, and celebrated trials in the Victorian era would place toxicology at the centre of criminal justice. But in 1823, as the guillotine fell at the Place de Grève, the modern discipline had not yet found its footing. The case endures because it illustrates a moment of transition, where science wished to speak confidently but could not, when the court required certainty yet had to proceed without it, and when the fragile boundary between evidence and inference shaped a verdict with consequences that still echo through the history of forensic investigation. Further particulars. The Victorian enthusiasm for tales of the American Wild West was both enduring and widespread. Long before the cinema popularized the frontier, British newspapers were already reprinting stories from across the Atlantic, accounts of outlaws, vigilantes, and improbable encounters in distant territories. These narratives bore little resemblance to the quiet streets of Kent or Surrey, yet they were read with great appetite. The following incident, published in an East Kent newspaper in March 1888, is a characteristic example. Set not in England at all, but in Texas, and carried to Britain by way of American press exchanges. It offers one of those brief, startling conversations that Victorian editors delighted in preserving. From the East Kent Gazette, March 1888, Horse Thief. A gentleman travelling in a Pullman car in Pennsylvania happened to say that he was from Texas. "Do you live in the western portion?" asked a man opposite. "I do." "In Tom Green County?" "That's my county." "Do you live near Carson?" "That's my town," came the reply. "Perhaps you know my brother, William Henry Jones." "Know him?" "Give me a hand, stranger." "I helped to hang William Henry the night before I left. He was a horse thief, but a good one." And that brings us to the end of today's case. If you've enjoyed our journey through an early forensic science, or what passed for science, in 1823, do consider giving the episode a like and a share. It helps nudge the YouTube algorithm, which otherwise behaves rather like an overworked Victorian clerk, well-meaning but terribly slow without encouragement. If you'd like more, our Patreon now holds over 820 episodes, including several series that can only be seen on Patreon, all available for a very modest £5 a month. It keeps the research flowing, the archives open, and the kettle on. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time examiner of mislaid wills, reluctant supervisor of 19th century chemistry experiments, an occasional referee in disputes between Victorian doctors and their increasingly nervous patients. And if you only take one thing from today's episode, let it be this. Always keep an eye on your tea, your paperwork, and that suspicious cat who sits on the garden wall and watches you knowingly. You know the one. Until next time. Same News of the Time and same News of the Time channel.